So let's take a look at a few of the units that bring the most value for their points in Warhammer 40k, with a review of 10 of the strongest units in the game. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking powerful units in Warhammer 40k, going through a rough ranking of 10 of the biggest and baddest threats around and what makes them good. I did make a similar video to this at the very start of 10th edition, but given that there's been big balance changes since then, lots of the list has changed really quite a lot. In fact, there's only one entry I've chosen to keep the same, otherwise I've decided to talk about other strong things for the factions, even if they still get honourable mentions. This list is mainly meant to be a bit of fun. Obviously units in Warhammer 40k do very different things. They don't really directly compare between damage dealers and big buffing units or objective scorers, so it's mainly just a fun idea to talk through 10 of the most auto-include units for their points costs in various lists at the moment, units that are likely to make your list a lot stronger if you include them in a faction compared with not doing so. For the sake of interest, I thought we'd do no more than one primary unit per faction, just so we get a bit of variety. I certainly could have made half the list about Eldar and Chaos Space Marines if desired, but I'll talk through a couple of their other strong options when we talk about their faction. Starting out, here are just a few honourable mentions for a few things that I probably could have included on the list, but chose not to this time. The Triumph of St. Catherine I think is pretty awesome value for the 125 points it is. Relatively tough, some fight, and get some pretty nasty buffs that you can feed and do weird things with miracle dice. It is one pathway to making the single most vicious multi-melter in the game pretty much. The Calatus Assassin is a very common sight in Imperial lists, jumping on and off the board to claim secondary objectives while debuffing enemy CP. Death Leaper is rare not to be seen in Tyranny's list, a cheap and effective lone operative that's very fighty and surprisingly tough. Biovores for automatically stealing points are no bad thing either. For the Chaos Knights, the dual powerhouses of the Wardog Carnivore and the Wardog Brigand are rather good. Definitely very strong units for the cost and frequently seeing allied use in other Chaos lists. Azrael's pretty awesome for the Dark Angels, generating command points and both damage and defense buffs, and Thunderwolves are great for their rivals the Space Wolves, advance and charge at long distances. Typhus I think is a rather nice include for Deathguard, though I feel like they've got quite a lot of balanced choices. His blast of mortal wounds each turn is rather good though, never mind what else he does. And for the Genestealer cults I might be most tempted to give it to the Neophytes or Acolytes, or potentially the Primuses that might be leading them. Enormous pinpoint damage for the cost, though perhaps do require a bit of command point support for all that. Just a few other thoughts, not an exhaustive list, and I have chosen to leave out Necrons and Abmech for the time being, given that at time of recording we don't have points costs for them. Getting into the top 10 proper though, and I have done a joint 10th place with Lord Solar Leontus first. The Guard may not be doing quite so well at the moment in terms of tournament standings, but Lord Solar is pretty much a staple in most lists. If other factions could take this guy, I feel like they certainly would be. He generates one command point per turn, which is nice and reliable and excellent for getting more reinforcements on the board. He comes with 3 orders to push out to 6 inches, and these can be tank orders as well, so that means that he is the single most efficient source of tank orders, weirdly enough. He's perhaps particularly well suited to buffing artillery in a little firebase, given that he sort of wants to stay safe to generate his command points. Then he'll allow you to redeploy 3 units on the board. You don't get to know who's got first turn yet, but that's still really quite a powerful ability. It means that you should be able to position those units so that they can have the good first strike on the opponent, or just be a little bit safer from enemy return fire. And then finally, as if that weren't enough, he's got a reasonable enough melee profile in himself, a bunch of strength 6 and AP-2 attacks with conquest, so fighting kind of similar to a standard Space Marine captain, and also 8 wounds at a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable means he isn't too bad in defense either. Overall, I feel like between those first 3 buffs alone though, he's just a fairly spectacular buffing character overall, never mind if he does actually contribute to the fight late in the game to try and repel the enemy from guard objectives. Otherwise for the Imperial Guard, maybe Gaunt's Ghost might have been the other biggest auto-include unit, a handy durable unit of lone operatives to bounce around the board doing secondary objectives, with a fair bit of flexibility with their orders as well, plus being able to chip in a little bit of annoying fire support early game from their sniper and autocannon. Otherwise, in joint 10th place I've chosen to rank the Sagitaur. The Leagues of Votan are certainly a pretty terrifying faction in tournament win rates at the moment, and Sagitaurs tend to be one of the most run units in the faction, really quite cheap transports armed with bolt cannons, and then usually either backing that up with a high las beam cannon or a bunch of missiles, depending on whether or not you want to tailor your damage slightly more to heavy tanks and armour, or be a bit more general purpose against medium infantry. Basically, these things are good enough to want in bulk for their own stats alone, and the transported unit is almost a bonus. They scout 6 inches and have a 12-inch regular move. Their durability is fine at toughness 10, 9 wounds and a 3+ save. I think that's absolutely okay for 100 points given how hard they hit. And all that firepower will often be focused with a +1 to hit and +1 to wound from the leagues of Votan pre-game marked targets, which are likely to prioritise enemy tanks and heavy hitters. They can be pretty interesting for splitting Hearthkin squads in two, giving you some cheap units to hold down objectives, something that the leagues of Votan don't really have much of. I find to deliver Berserks to melee as well, and I've seen them used with just Grimnirs inside them as well, which is an interesting choice, sacrificing some slight durability from half a Hearthkin squad for some fairly serious psychic damage. Overall pretty awesome, and they do tend to get used en masse. Otherwise for the Votan, Einhir, Hearthguard, Grav Thunderkin, or the Land Fortresses could have all been picks. They're all pretty strong in their own right. Next up, I'm moving on to the Greenskins, and one near auto-include unit in a whole bunch of competitive lists recently is the mighty Mozrog Skragbad. It seems that he's getting the nod far more than the beast boss on Squigosaur these days. Just a murderous all-round threat, a very tough boss on a Squigosaur that can handle himself against the heaviest stuff in the game. He's almost 200 points and can be targeted directly, but is very tough for the cost. Toughness 10 and a 3+ save, with a big 9 wounds and a 4+ invulnerable and a 4+ feel no pain will just take a lot of focus fire to gun down, particularly as he can also threaten a 1 command point stratagem for -1 to wound if it makes sense. In combat he fights with Gut Ripper, 6 attacks with strength 7, AP 1 and damage 3, with anti-vehicle and anti-monster, so great for taking down tough stuff which orcs can sometimes struggle with, plus an extra 3 attacks from Big Chomper's Jaws, which strike at AP 2 and damage 4, and also get critical wounds on a 5+, giving you the chance for more devastating wounds. He gets +1 damage versus vehicles as well, as if that weren't enough, and +2 against Titanics, so pretty excellent to throw him against an enemy knight or something. Never mind the benefits that he gets from being orcs, sustained hits from the detachment, and the benefits of War on that turn. At 200 points and a massive melee threat, he is good enough to target with most stratagems as well, particularly that -1 to wounds, but critical hits on a 5+ isn't the worst, and between all this he does seem to crop up in far more competitive lists than he doesn't right now. Otherwise though, I feel like orcs have got lots of other datasheets that have got pretty outstanding value. Gretchen just for 40 points for a pretty crazy 22 objective control, plus the ability to do secondaries and rustle up CP is great all around. I could have been very tempted to put them as the choice for orcs, to be honest. Both the War Boss and the Beast Boss are great in their own right, often leading knobs or beast snagger boys into battle. Captain Badrug and the Flash Skits are an enormous fire support crew, and they're often jumping out of the very cheap and efficient truck. Even though it went up 10 points, it's still one of the better transports in the game. Moving on to some Space Marines next, and for these guys I struggled to put anything else other than the fairly godly Inceptors. 110 points that you really can't go too far wrong with in a list. You could easily take a couple of units just to give you massive options with where you drop to claim secondary objectives, never mind useful pinpoint damage that could be absolutely brutal in the right situation. Inceptors are mainly here for that 3-inch drop, rather than needing to be outside of 9 inches when they come onto the board. They can drop just outside of 3, and that can let them set up in the backfield to near guarantee secondary objectives like deploying teleport homers or behind enemy lines, or just ideally drop somewhere where they're both fairly safe from enemy reprisals and also in a position to bully one isolated enemy unit, lighting them up with either Assault Bolter or Plasma Fire, both of which are strong against their own targets. The Assault Bolters outperform against Marine equivalents, the Plasmas are better against 3-wound infantry and really tough stuff. Both are twin-linked and have the pistol keyword as well, so you can't charge them just to stop their damage output. Otherwise, you could even potentially do gaming moves by dropping them on primaries that the opponent had poorly defended and had units only just towing onto, and they've got good advantages from multiple different Space Marine detachments. The Vanguard Spearhead being able to put these back into the sky again is very threatening, but Gladius Task Force for movement shenanigans in later turns, and Firestorm for +1 strength and even threatening a +1 to wound stratagem could be nice as well. Otherwise, plenty of other good Space Marine units that could have rivaled here. Gladiator Lancers are just awesome fire support for their points cost, often well capable of just slapping an enemy tank dead from all the way across the other side of the board. Aggressors can get some very nasty combos, particularly in Gladius and Firestorm. I feel like there probably should be some recognition of the humble Scout Squad as well. 55 points for just very good defensive stats, being able to infiltrate and jump on and off the board for secondaries, again mean that there are Marine units that you can very rarely go wrong with. Talking of secondary shenanigans, and ranked with a number to please the grandfather, are the Nurglings. Obviously at 35 points they're not going to be carrying any sort of damage output or winning games just by themselves, but as secondary support units go for this kind of cost, they perhaps seem to be some of the very best around. For 35 points you get 3 bases of them, and that's 12 wounds worth of defense with a 6+ invulnerable save. Basically nothing in the game is going to be all that efficient against them, just given that many wounds at that lower points cost. You have around about 3 points per wound there, and they're just quite nice to have at the outline points of your army to soak enemy fire. For secondary things though, they both get the options to infiltrate and also deep strike. So for doing tactical secondaries, you can have annoying units far forward to be able to do any early game secondaries, and you can have some in reserves to say drop in the corners of the board or try and tow into the enemy deployment zone, as even with objective control 0, they're still great for that. On top of that, they're -1 to hit within 6 inches, which just means that if you have a fair few of them around, then a lot of the enemy army might well be debuffed. They're not going to want to have to shy away from these guys when they're so cheap, particularly if they're going to be on objectives, so potentially just to threaten bubbles of that, you might just cut a whole bunch of the enemy damage output as the game goes along, and save the actual main bulk of your force a bit of fire, and this makes them yet tougher in combat as well if the enemy is -1 to hit them. Overall, if there was just about any chaos list that could take them, I'd be tempted to take at least a swarm or two, and I have certainly seen many lists go far heavier as they are battle line. Really quite a fun and interesting unit, just gives you loads of board control for not that many points at all, even if with objective control 0 they aren't going to be scoring primary points, and they're not really going to be doing anything besides a little bit of chip damage with their lethal hits combat. Otherwise for demons, maybe other choices could have been Shalaxi Hellbane or Be'lakor. Shalaxi basically just kills anything in combat. Be'lakor stops half your army getting shot from long range each turn, plus brings some Shadow of the Warp, and perhaps Celeste could be worth a shout as well, just very very good value out of one Demon Prince for the amount of melee damage it brings. Moving on to the Tau Empire, and next I've chosen to rank the Tetras, maybe a little bit of an unusual choice, but I'd say they're arguably the single best Forge World unit in the game right now, again ridiculously cheap, and turn Tau Ballistic Skill 4+ units into things that hit almost all the time, the single best marker light providers in the codex by a wide margin. Any Tau unit can be a spotter, giving you an extra +1 to hit and ignore cover, and ideally spotting for something scary, maybe crisis suits, but there's loads of other options: broadsides, sky rays, hammerheads, riptides, and lots more. But the Tetras go one further and also allow you 4 rerolls to hit for that, basically giving you a +78% damage, never mind anything else you might have from Kauyon with sustained hits too potentially. For 80 points that's generally more than enough damage output increase. They won't be doing any damage themselves as they're only armed with a couple of pulse rifles, but given that they make your firepower quite so crazily strong out of other units, essentially they are loaded with a bunch of damage essentially. Then beyond that, they're kind of standout tough for the cost as well. 14 wounds at toughness 7 and a 4+ save for 80 points is very very good. Basically no real firepower is going to be particularly efficient into that, and they're a very durable part of the army, and beyond that they're very fast, and they get infiltrators as well, meaning while they're providing their buffs they could also act as a screening unit if it made sense, or be in a position to do early game secondary objectives, or even do enormous move block moves if it made sense to. 2 Tetras parked up in front of the opponent's army could basically delay their entire movement into the midfield for a turn. Overall standout good value. Otherwise for Tau units I could have talked about plenty of the others. I feel like their codex is fairly well balanced right now. Maybe the rather terrifying damage of Cyclic Iron Blaster Crisis Suits might have been one of the most obvious ones to talk about, though they do come with their downsides. I do rather like the Ghost Kill as well with its lone operative shenanigans. In 5th place I've chosen to rank the Black Templar Crusader Squads. I thought it was worth mentioning both of them here. Both the Primaris variant and the Firstborn variant are just very cheap and surprisingly dangerous Space Marine bodies, rivaling just about anything else with power armor in the game. The Primaris squad might find its home a bit better in the Righteous Crusaders detachment, depending on whether you're trying to go more melee or more armored Black Templars, both are good. The Primaris Crusader squad is 280 points for 20 bodies, so just 14 points per Marine profile, which is kind of massive. And for some reason they seem to just get flatly more attacks than most others out there, getting 5 attacks with their chainswords when assault intercessors only get 4. Beyond that they have a few power fists and a power sword for the sword brother, and also get the scout keyword so they can be moving up with tons of objective control into the centre of the board nice and early. You could also use Grimaldus or the Tannhauser's Bones character to get them a 5+ Feel No Pain for yet more stat durability, or go for some more damage combos, maybe involving Helbrecht, perhaps with a Lieutenant. Overall very cheap, very murderous, and an absolute ton of objective control too. Pretty scary stuff all in all. Otherwise, for 65 points for 5 models, there's the Firstborn Crusader Squad. These guys seem to find their home a bit more naturally in the Ironstorm Spearhead, though they're pretty good whatever. These just seem just weird and crazily undercosted at 65 points. 13 points per marine body and power armor is even more durability than the Primaris variant, plus they also come with a las cannon and a special weapon within that 5-man unit, and also some sort of melee weapon on the sergeant. They stand out tough for the cost, so to be able to pack a bunch of las cannons into the bargain is just all around good. They're very nice in the Ironstorm Spearhead in particular, with the single reroll that can get you. It does make those single las cannon shots really quite punchy and reliable. Otherwise, I guess for the Black Templars, a bunch of the tanks could have been well worth a mention as well. Getting multi-melters either for free or a cheap 5-point upgrade makes them pretty much flat better than the standard Space Marine versions, and Gladiators and Repulsors are rather good already. In 4th place, I've chosen to rank Magnus the Red, basically the linchpin of the Thousand Sons army, and even with a slightly higher points cost than he had before at 440 points, he does still seem to be pretty much auto-include when they make war. He is fairly hard to take out, though I'd still say that probably durability is his weakest part. His toughness 11 with 16 wounds, a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and a -1 damage if he chooses that buff. All of that is pretty great on any individual model, but given that that model's a quarter of your army at 2000 points, it's not actually that great durability for the cost. Broadly I'd say it's more his buffs and damage output that I'd be more impressed by. He has enormous damage stats in his own right between the Gaze of Magnus, Tzeentch's Firestorm, and the Blade of Magnus, all with +1 to hit and +1 to wound from his own psychic buffs, and it just means he could absolutely ruin a big chunk of the enemy army, potentially taking down multiple vehicles in any one turn if he rolled kind of well. He buffs other nearby psyche attacks with the same, which is quite nice when Thousand Sons tend to run quite so sorcerer heavy, and he can make some spectacular damage combos with the Scarab Occult Terminators and magical bolt weapons if you'd like to. Beyond that, as being the best psychic damage dealer and the Thousand Sons having a detachment in the Cult of Magic that really focuses around psychic damage, he just tends to be one of the best options to use most of the buffing abilities on. He can have 1 CP to reroll all hits and wounds with psychic shooting, which is massive, and potentially even the double move is rather interesting for him. He could potentially move 32 inches in a turn with his massive movement, and then hit the enemy with some enormous psychic range damage. That could be kind of game-changing later in the game to hunt down enemy units on objectives. Overall, he very much still seems to be an auto-include alpha sorcerer, and if you can manage to keep him alive for a few turns, then he's almost certainly going to reap a heavy toll on the enemy army. Next up, and from Tzeentch to Khorne. With the World Eaters, I certainly could have mentioned Angron with his game-changing respawn mechanic, though that is a bit random as to whether or not you get him back. But perhaps just for standout fighty value on a melee character, it's kind of hard to beat the Master of Executions. For the points cost, perhaps one of the single most dangerous characters in all of 40k. He's 80 points, and people usually upgrade him with the Berserker Glaive for an extra 25 points, which adds some big threat to his melee weapons, giving him +1 attack and +1 damage, or plus D3 to each on the charge. First up, he grants fights first to Khorne Berserkers, which is pretty excellent if they're in the midfield. It means that if the opponent wants to charge them, then they're going to be taking some heavy damage from this guy first, and certain units just really might not be able to justify charging his unit unless they want most of their squad to be 1 head shorter. His base stats are kind of unassuming on the standard profile, 5 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 7, AP 2 and damage 2, but he can stack an enormous amount of boosts on that. He gets devastating wounds and precision, so he could certainly be sniping out a character from the middle of a squad, and any 6s to wounds are devastating. He gets to reroll hits and wounds against characters and units led by characters, which is fairly common for big elite units he might well be skirmishing with in the midfield. Again, that ups the chance of devastating wounds as well. Then on the charge, he'll get +1 attack and +1 strength just from the World Eater's core detachment rule, so often strength 8 and 6 attacks at base. Never mind the extra D3 that he gets to attacks and damage on the charge as well, so potentially all the way up to 8 or 9 attacks, and hitting with damage D3 +2, so we'll be killing Terminators in any one swing, and be really quite a big threat to heavies like monsters and vehicles. Just in case that wasn't enough as well though, he might well be able to make use of certain blessings of Khorne if you aren't just using the movement ones to get things to combat this turn. And there is the option for a 1 command point for a +1 to wound as well, which could be really quite meaningful if he isn't fighting against characters, still making him enormously threatening with that big damage profile. Overall, a pretty fantastic guy to have around, and a fairly cheap worst nightmare for the enemy's elites that want to be trying to skirmish an objective of him. Moving up, and in second place I've ranked the Chosen. Perhaps not too surprising a choice for these ones, given just how often they crop up in competitive lists. 110 points for a very efficient 5-man squad, usually led up by a Chaos Lord. These guys just excel by just about every metric. They have 3 wounds per model, which is absolutely fine for that points cost. Their durability is good. And then 4 attacks per model at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 1, really quite nice for marine or horde clearance, plus a power fist and a little bit of range damage, threatening some plasma pistol and combi fire. Typically they'll be run with the Mark of Chaos Undivided, where they can threaten the full reroll stratagem, so you can reroll all hits and all wound rolls as well, and have plenty of options for things like sustained hits or lethal hit dart packs if that made more sense and not using the stratagem. You can get it for free potentially with a Chaos Lord though, who usually tends to accompany them into battle. That Chaos Lord will typically be rocking a Demon Hammer with a strength 8 and damage 2, though once per game you can get +1 to basically most of his stats. Big strength 3 damage hits with devastating wounds are rather awesome, and again combo very well with that stratagem. And between that profile and the regular chosen profile, they'll clear out most infantry and also put a grave amount of damage on most vehicles too. There's not really a lot in the game that really wants to get charged by them. Finally, they'll likely be taxied into battle by a Rhino March with the Mark of Nurgle, a nice cheap transport to deliver them into battle to scrap over midfield objectives, and the Mark of Nurgle means that even if it's sitting in the open, you can threaten the can't shoot me type stratagem if it's going to be big, stopping their ride from being popped too early, and making sure they're not foot slogging in the early game. I feel like these guys have become quite so ubiquitous that they're probably going to get some sort of points nerf come the January balance slate. That entire package is just something that you can't really go too far wrong with at the moment, to the extent where it maybe is a bit oppressive to other options in the index. Otherwise though, plenty of other strong stuff I could have talked about for Chaos Space Marines, maybe some of the most standout being Obliterators and Forge Fiends, either marched with Nurgle or Undivided, for their various flavours of very terrifying firepower. Maybe Accursed Cultists for big objective control regrowing and great support from the Dark Commune. Maybe Warp Talons could have been worth a mention as well for very fast and blendy melee. Finally, and the unit that I've chosen to rank first on this list is the Eldari Wraithguard. Though admittedly there's really quite a lot of other stuff that I could have talked about for Eldari, there's certainly a faction with some big and scary options at the moment. Typically, Eldari armies tend to revolve around one big block of 10 Wraithguards stomping up the midboard though to take down one central objective, while spitting out some spectacular damage with a big amount of anti-tank Wraith Cannon fire. From the army, they're one of the most tanky units around, with toughness 7, a 3+ save and 3 wounds. They could potentially be picking up things like a 5+ feel no pain from a Fortune Farseer. On the offensive, they open up fire with their Wraith Cannons, 1 attack each at 18 inches, strength 14, AP 4 and damage D6 with devastating wounds. Basically one squad of these getting to fire at an enemy heavy hitter within range should have a good chance of killing most standard vehicles. You can plug in Fate dice to get some automatic devastating wounds and bypass invulnerable saves if it matters, or even just get automatic wounds with lethal hits, plus the Spirit Seer that's inevitably leading them. The Battle Host rerolls are pretty great on that kind of profile as well, and once per battle round they can shoot for free one time that they're shot, and they don't even need to return fire at the unit that was firing at them. They can just turn around and light up something completely different, just spectacularly enormous damage in the enemy's turn, and likely with good lines of sight right from the middle of the board. They could just utterly ruin a unit that was just about to try and charge them, for example. Then they've got rather godly movement tricks as well. They're only locked out of one of the Eldari Battle Host stratagems, and they can use big repositioning tricks like Phantasm to line up lines of sight, perhaps even in the enemy turn, or decide to keep safe should they wish to, or even just to gain more movement and threat up the board and push up to objectives. You also can't lock them up in combat to shot up their firepower, as just for 1 CP they can fall back and shoot, more than worth it with that kind of Wraith Cannon fire. Then on top of all that, the Spirit Seer is just ridiculously good value as a buffing character. Lethal hits for the unit, which is never a bad thing. Perhaps more importantly, a +1 to hit, so they're hitting on a 3, not on a 4. Overall much more threatening there. They also act as basically an apothecary, resurrecting essentially a 34-point model in your command phase, which is huge threat to return to the board each turn. They are usually going to be a unit that might take some damage but not be outright destroyed. And that Spirit Seer is an excellent choice for the Fate's Messenger enhancement as well, which helps out the Wraithguard enormously. You get to flip a dice to an automatic 6 both in your turn and the enemy turn, so that 6 could be a wound roll on a Wraith Cannon's devastating wounds, or it could be a save roll. Often if that was a las cannon shooting them, you could just turn a dead Wraithguard into an alive one, or at least as alive as any of these Ghost Warriors get. Just ridiculous value overall, and they're a unit that's going to cause problems to basically every enemy army. Ideally, you just need enormous, ridiculous amounts of focus fire, and even then they might be able to do movement tricks with Phantasm to avoid a chunk of it. Again, I could certainly see these being toned down in the January balance pass. I wouldn't be too surprised if Spirit Seers went up a bit. They're just a hard unit for most people to play around. Otherwise though, as mentioned, there's loads for Eldari. Night Spinners could have easily been my pick as well, just slowing down enemy units, plus some fairly nice indirect fire with some devastating wounds. The Incarn is rather awesome as well, being able to teleport round the board with a very durable avatar profile and is no slouch in combat either. And various anti-tank weapon profiles like Fire Prisms or War Walkers are still awesome with their big damage profiles and the Battle Host rerolls, plus their own unique abilities. Even amongst these though, Wraithguard do seem kind of stand out. So anyway, hope you've enjoyed a quick breakdown of a few of the strongest units in Warhammer 40k right now. Let me know your thoughts on them and if you played against any of them in game. As always, look forward to hearing your thoughts and insights down in the comments below. Is there anything else that you think I should have included on this list as well? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.